Hello, and welcome to this month's painting tutorial. This month we're going to take a look at a landscape with some livestock in it, specifically these beautiful flying white cranes. So let's start by sketching it out on our watercolor paper. And I'm going to begin by placing the horizon line. This is the main line of the composition, and currently it's almost exactly in the center. That's no good. You don't ever want to divide your picture plane into even parts. So I'm going to lower it a little bit and make that sky a little bit bigger. So let's put the horizon line right here in the lower third, and then I'm going to start to develop this large shape of foliage in the background. And then there are these bushy trees. Okay, see, I'm just working really loosely. And I don't want this to be right in the center of my piece either, so I'm keeping it tucked over. And then we're going to have a lot of these plants and things in the water and this large foreground shape of leaves right here. Now where I want to take the most care is in placing these cranes. So I'm going to take some time now and draw these birds in flight. And then what I'm going to do is use a super nib masking fluid pen like this. And then I'm just going to protect those white birds. Now here's the reference material, and here's the way the painting looks with those cranes drawn and protected in masking fluid. But now it's time to start painting. When you're watercolor painting, you always work from the back to front. Start with your sky. I want to match this blue, so I'm going to use a scrap piece of watercolor paper with a square cut out of it, and I'm going to mix up some blues until I get the right tone. Ooh, that looks like the ticket right there. Okay. So then I'm just going to paint that color right over the top, right over all these weeds, and right over, of course, those cranes that I protected. This is an easy sky. It's all one solid color. Now there are similar colors down here in the water, so the only other thing I can do right now is to paint that water. I can't paint this foliage because if I touch the green to my wet sky, I'm going to get bleeds. I don't want bleeds, so I will just put in some of these colors in the water. I'm going to spritz it a little bit because my colors are drying out and I don't want them to be too edgy. Then also up here, there's some green reflecting into the water. So while this watercolor is wet, I'm going to work in some green. Because it's not too sopping wet, those colors should mix fairly easily. Touch in some of these colors. I'm just switching between blues and browns here and adding some lines. Where the paper is wet, it's going to bleed out, and where it's still dry, I'll get some nice edges. So it's an easy way to put down realistic water that still looks interesting in your painting. You don't want to be fussing and fussing and fussing. Now before this dries, I want to make sure that I have my reflections preserved because there are some reflections of these white birds. So I'm just going to take a clean, damp brush and blot, 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 like this, right underneath the birds where they're standing above the water. Make sure that you dry your brush off pretty well before you do this, otherwise you're going to get big droplets of water that will bleed. But that is a good place to stop. Let the water in the sky dry completely, and then we'll push forward. Now the sky and water are dry, so I'm going to start to dry brush in these foliage in the background. So I'm going to get a large round and mix up that green using the same technique. I want to match the color first. Then once you've matched your color, just use a round brush and sort of bounce in the foliage like this. I'm going to use different colors for the trees and bushes in the background and foreground. So I'm going to start in the background, and for the shadows I'm going to use some blue over the top. So you can just bounce, bounce, bounce in a little bit of blue. I'm just going to get those shadows established before the color dries. And then it can all spread out while everything is wet and mix it together in a more realistic way. And you can spritz the paint a little bit like this and help it to spread, and you can also use your brush handle and do some little tapping on the outside edge here to get some really small lines without using the brush. Get your darks and your contrasts really intense, because don't forget they're going to dry lighter. Then in the foreground, it's a yellow ochre color, and just tap it down like this and let it sort of bleed up. But remember, you don't ever want just one color on the page. It's much more interesting to let 2 or 3 mix. So underneath the ochre, I'm going to add some kind of toned down green. And then before that has a chance to dry, I'll scrape through a little bit and let that do its thing on its own. You can also use the brush on the side and sort of drag it around like this, and you get some really cool textures this way. I'm going to make it a little darker down here. Notice how I'm keeping some white space, and then I'm going to bump up the contrast even more and get the shadow place down at the bottom that I see. You're going to have the best effect when you juxtapose really darks against the bright whites. So right around these crane heads, I'm going to go in with that dark. I'm just adding a few little dabs here and there with some pure green again. But you're going to have the best luck getting these colors to move if everything is fresh at this stage. Okay, then there's some bright orangey and ochres in these weeds down here. I'm just going to blob them in while it's still wet. And since I'm painting wet on wet, these colors are going to mix into each other freely, and they're going to do a lot of bleeding. So I just have this green stripe. And down here, I'll strengthen that a little bit. Then I'm going to let it dry again. Okay, this turned out well. So now I'm ready to add these Kelly green leaf shapes to the foreground. Match your colors. Looks pretty good. Yeah. Okay, so there are several shades of green in this foliage, and I could either drive myself crazy painting every single leaf, or I could stipple over a base tone and then let that semi-dry, stipple in the shadow colors and try to leave some highlights. That is what I am going to opt for. So I'm going to take my mid-green shade and just stipple, stipple, stipple. And while I'm doing it, I'm going to vary the color a little bit so that I get some of those different shapes and shades of green. So I'm going to have some green, and then I'll stipple in with a darker shade here. And then there's a few spots in the grass. I'm getting closer to the foreground, and remember what happens when you get close to the foreground. Your detail needs to spring up a level because the eye can see more. Alright, so to paint some small leaves, I'm going to go to a small round and just carefully shape a leaf or two. So I'm just going to do the same thing as before, where I add some different colors, but I'm using a small brush so that I can get more detail. Now, in the foreground, I've got my picture nice and close, and I can see some of these shadow shapes. I'm going to bump up to my larger brush again and work on putting in some of these shapes of shadows more quickly. Then I'll get a lighter color on the same brush and start to develop some lighter leaves. So this is more deliberate, but it's still very vague and low detail. So now I'm just going to have to pick out some spots and drop in some more dark shadow shapes. And this is just a matter of taking your time, paying close attention to the reference material, and adding those darks on top of your midtones. Now this foliage in the background is dry, in the foreground as well. Now what I did to add some interesting patterns and stay away from overpainting is I protected the foliage up here and the river down here, and I spattered in these different colors. So that worked out so well. I'm going to do it in the foreground as well, and I'll show you how I did that now. So use a cloth or a piece of paper and protect everything in your painting that you don't want to get covered with paint. Now, I'm just spattering right in here, so just load your brush. There's a lot of color on this brush, and then I'm just going to spatter it in like this. Then I'll rinse that color out, and I'll do the same thing with some yellow-green. Okay, after the spattering is done, I'm going to remove everything. Then my next step will be to use some of those same colors, but peel out a line or two and hand paint enough of these leaves that you can get the whole area looking like leaves. I'm going to let this foreground shape dry and carefully remove the cranes from the rest of the painting. Now I can take a small brush and I'll just emphasize some of these small details up front. And then when you're working in water, you always want to use a little bit of the same color, anything that would be reflecting in the water, and draw it down like ripples. Different pressure on the brush will help those lines go from fat to thin very realistically. But then also what I'm going to do is pick up some of the color of these backgrounds and sharpen up the outlines of the cranes wherever they got a little bit fuzzy. At the base of these plants, I'm going to use a small brush and I want to bring out the edge. So those need to be kept really dark. So in this step, I'm using the existing textures and trying to make them more in line with what I see on the photograph. And that's just going to take time on my little brush and some patience. In the background here I can see some little stems of these orange plants. Whip, 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 up like this. Each grass blade is one stroke. Add a little bit more of this green color here. Now to paint these rods, I'm going to use my rigger brush. I've got some ochre and red on here. I'm just going to carefully determine where I want it placed and then zoop, one line. Now the key to doing these well is going to be to have enough paint on the brush that I can do it in one pass. And also to eyeball where each grass begins and ends. And you're going to need plenty of paint on the brush, otherwise these red shapes will not layer over the green ones well enough. Move over here and do the same thing. And by the way, the sky won't fall if you don't paint every single one of them. I don't have any obligation as an artist to recreate nature. I'm just trying to paint a pleasing scene. So when I get to the birds, I'm going to add the beaks with the rigger brush. Since I have so many birds, it makes sense to go ahead and add all the beaks at once while the color's on my brush. With a different, larger round, I'll mix up the shadow color that I see on the feathers. Then I can draw that color in with my brush, just like this. And in this way I add the shadow to the wing. You can also see just a little bit of detail in the neck and throat, and here to this bird, and so on and so forth until I'm satisfied with all the birds. So I have a lot to work on here. This is going to be the detail phase, and after that the painting will be complete or nearly complete. Now after doing some more detail work in the foliage and background, here's what I've come up with for the finished painting. You can see how in order to make the landscape with foliage elements, water, and then some really bright, highly detailed elements in the foreground, you need to protect those white details and then paint from the back forward so that you can layer subsequent details on top of the background, and that way you get a nice realistic effect. So that concludes this month's painting tutorial. I hope you've learned some things you can take back to your own studio. I'm going to upload the file so that you can try your hand at this fun and somewhat complicated piece, and I hope that you will join me next time for another painting tutorial. Thanks so much for watching.